Now that you know what a literature review is, it's time to think more about the purposes your literature review will serve. According to the APA Publication Manual, literature reviews serve 4 major purposes. The first is to define and clarify a problem. By way of example, I've pulled excerpts from a review article called Monitoring Training Load to Understand Fatigue in Athletes, which appeared in the journal Sports Medicine in 2014. The article reviews existing literature about fatigue in athletes and tools for monitoring training load, and it makes recommendations for how to take a scientific approach to designing and monitoring training programs. So let's look at how this article defines and clarifies a problem. This excerpt appears on page 140 if you want to follow along as I read. Monitoring the training load of an athlete is viewed by many as important to determine whether an athlete is adapting to the training program and to minimize the risk of non-functional overreaching, fatigue lasting weeks to months, injury, and illness. To date, research in this area is limited, and much of what we know about monitoring comes from personal experience and anecdotal information. While monitoring within elite and professional sport is often extensive, much of these data remain protected and unpublished. The objective of this article is to describe the current scientific information available relating to tools for monitoring training load in athletes, and to outline some of the practical considerations when both planning and implementing monitoring in athletes. So what problem is this literature review responding to? These paragraphs, which occur near the beginning of the review, show us that monitoring training load and fatigue is important for athletes, but there's little available research on monitoring. The second purpose of a literature review is to inform the reader of the state of research by summarizing previous investigations. This excerpt appears in section 6.12, Psychomotor Speed, on page 144. Fatigued athletes often report impaired concentration and cognitive complaints. Therefore, investigation into psychomotor speed might provide insight into the cognitive load induced by exercise. Impairments in psychomotor speed following 2 weeks of overload training have been observed in well-trained cyclists and in functionally overreached cyclists. Psychomotor speed is most often assessed using computer-based reaction time and rapid visual information processing tasks, and therefore can be affordable. While this measure may be applicable for examining overreached athletes, it is yet to receive research attention in the area of determining cognitive load as an indicator of internal load. Notice that this passage of the literature review draws from 3 different sources, indicated by the numbers in brackets. It's common for literature reviews to integrate sources, discussing multiple studies at once, as opposed to describing them one at a time. You might also notice that this literature review doesn't mention the journal that the study was published in, or even the names of the authors. It's important to cite your sources so that readers can reference them. But unlike writing in the humanities, science writing tends to focus on findings of studies as opposed to those studies' authors or the publications they appear in. This passage tells us what we need to know about the relationship between psychomotor speed and fatigue or overreach, but it also emphasizes what we don't know. That gets us to the third purpose, to identify relations, contradictions, gaps, and inconsistencies in the literature. This passage can be found in section 6.9, Heart Rate Variability, on page 143. The measurement of resting or post-exercise heart rate variability has been suggested to indicate both positive and negative adaptations to training. However, the varying methodological approaches employed, as well as high day-to-day variability in environmental and homeostatic factors, have resulted in inconsistent findings in the scientific literature. As such, heart rate variability has been shown to increase without a change in fitness, as well as decrease alongside increases in fitness. Increases, decreases, and no change in heart rate variability have also been reported in the overtraining literature. To overcome some of the inconsistencies in findings, it has been suggested that both weekly and 7-day rolling averages have higher validity than single-day measurements. Notice how this section explains and gives examples of some of the inconsistencies in the research on heart rate variability. It also tells us how trainers might overcome some of those inconsistencies. Essentially, it answers the question, so what do we do about this? And it incorporates findings from 5 different studies. Notice that it doesn't give a full summary of each. It only uses the information that is relevant to this section. So, we're looking at a review article and not the introduction to an empirical study. In the case of a literature review that's setting up a study, you might see something like this. But you'd also probably see the authors highlighting a very specific gap in the research, a gap that their study is intended to fill. The final purpose is to suggest the next steps in solving the problem. We're actually going to look at the way a table in the literature review accomplishes this purpose. You can find this table on pages 145 to 146 of the article. Take a moment to skim the key features of a sustainable monitoring system listed in the table. Hopefully, you notice that these are practical suggestions for how to create a good monitoring system. The authors of the literature review have shared a bunch of information about what we know and don't know about monitoring training load. Now, they're telling us what to do with it. I want to point out that this article is a standalone literature review. Purpose number 4, suggesting next steps, is fulfilled differently when the literature review is part of an empirical research project. In that case, the researchers will usually put forward their project's purpose and research question, and the study itself is the next step in solving the problem.